Welcome back to the studio, designers. What I'm going to do today is kind of walk through what I would consider maybe the basics of how I might approach drawing from life, which would be, sort of like a step beyond some of these like contour line exercises, and really more about setting up some objects in front of me or sitting down in front of some objects and doing my best to render them as accurately as possible. And you may find that using our templates is a really handy way to do this. But I want you to actually start thinking of these things a little bit like training wheels in some ways. They're really great to kind of help visualize some of these initial dilemmas, right? Like, how would I render this really kind of strangely complex form that has a ring within a ring and a split? The templates sort of help me really render it in, but in many ways they end up giving you these really flat images, and and sometimes for some reasons, for some purposes, maybe if you're working on a schematic, a really flat drawing would be great. But I want you to start to kind of push beyond the limits of kind of using these templates. I'll work through maybe 2 approaches to this guy here, and then by the end of this tutorial we'll actually be working on some shading. So what I'll do is I'll work through 2 approaches to this life drawing here, and I'll do them at about the scale that I want you to work up your life drawings in your sketchbook. Let's start with a fresh page so that you guys can see what I'm doing. I'll grab my darker pencils. You guys can probably still use your 6H pencils. That way it's a little bit easier to do your erasing. And then some shading at the end. Keep those pens handy. So maybe one of the first things that I would take a look at is just kind of consider, what's the kind of rough arrangement of these objects. So with my initial sketch, and this is even if I thought I might use the templates eventually, I want to arrange my objects here. I have 2 vertical oriented cylinders here, so I'm just going to kind of rough those in on the page. Let me make sure I've got a pencil here you guys can see. Here we go. That's maybe the width of my first cylinder, and then my second cylinder is overlapping, maybe not quite at the halfway point, but both cylinders are the same width. One of those cylinders is sitting in front of the other one, and so there will be an overlap where I can kind of see one but not the other. And then one of them has a sort of diagonal split here, and the cross section of a diagonal cut cylinder is an ellipse, so I'll lay in my ellipse. And then the other is the matching ellipse that sort of hides behind the other. And then they're both sitting on a block, and in the background of the block that cuts through just above the bottoms of the background cylinder, and the front cylinder kisses right against the edge of the frontal block. So there's my ground. This is how I would sort of rough in. You see how I've got this transparency thing going on where I'm seeing both cylinders completely, even though eventually I might erase them, and I see the background line cutting both through. Now if I was going to switch to working with some templates, this is the point where I might pull out my templates and see if any of my ovals are a reasonably close match. It looks like the way that I've drawn my cylinders out, I could use this larger ellipse here to kind of true up my drawings. So I'm going to just attempt that here. Make that nice and dark so you can see. And I'll be a little careful with this oval so that I don't draw the overlap where I can't see it. Okay, so if I was going to continue with the drawing in this way, I would want to account for the material thickness, the sort of wall thickness of my cylinder here. And so in order to do that with the template, I can't just start and stop with the ovals. I have to mark using those small perforations in your oval templates, or if you happen to have one of the oval templates with the lines in it, I put a little tick mark right at the XY lines here. And I'll use my clear straight edge to sort of mark the XY axis of that oval. And while I'm at it, I will do the same thing on this oval. Looks like I goofed and I made one of my ovals slightly larger than the other. Oh well. Straight down to there. There we go. Give an XY axis to that top oval. Once I have those axes, I can lay in a smaller diameter oval to establish the material thickness. And the XY axis is going to help me align my next sized smaller oval. So I have these sort of tick marks that allow me to render in an inset oval so that my wall thickness is even more or less all the way around. Okay. At this point, I can probably come in and lay in my outer walls too. As long as I stay true to my verticals. And I come in right at the outside or the widest edge of my ovals. Okay, and I don't see that back vertical, so I'm going to leave that one alone. And for these bottom ellipses, I could probably get away with using one of my oval templates here. Oh, just a little undersized. That's all right. This is mostly just to kind of get me in the ballpark anyway. So using templates, right, a fairly rough kind of initial sketch in, but I wanted to at least demonstrate one of those for you so that you got a sense of how I might sit down and use the training wheels, if you were, use the training wheels of a template to just kind of see how this all renders in. Now I have a lot of extra marks in here. I have my initial sketch that I did with a light pencil and just kind of roughly placed things into the scene. I also have my kind of XY axes ready, so I might come in with the eraser and just lighten those lines. I don't always try to pull them out completely because I may need them for referencing something else, but I do want to sort of pull those out just a bit. And as I'm erasing, if I accidentally get a little too excited with this guy, I can come back in and re-render any lines that got lifted out. Okay, so two basic approaches. Both of them accomplish a different sort of feel for the drawing. This is really precise contour drawing, something you might see in more like a mechanical engineer's sort of like reference book or something like that. But now they still feel incredibly flat, right? And so we've done a little bit of work with like adding some lines in sort of randomly. But the kind of question I want to answer next involves a slightly different technique or something a little bit newer. And for that, I'm going to pull out my 2D design sketchbook and actually reference an assignment that we did last semester. We were doing some basic sort of rendering similar to our 3D design work, but this page is the one that I was mostly interested in taking a look at. Now these are value rendering experiments. You see what we'll call these sort of like line work, these Xed lines, what we call cross hatching, moving from a darker to a lighter value. This one, if I get really close, you can see, is just a series of dots or stippled points moving from dark to light. These two values on this side are, they look almost identical on the video here, but this guy here is a vine charcoal, right? And an ink with a brush. What I would like for you guys to do is actually work up a page very similar to that. And for this, you may need, or you may like, to have a little template so you can quickly render out sort of a gradual changing boxes. Now, if you choose to, I'll do a quick demo here for you in a minute, but what I mostly want is I want enough boxes for you to render a minimum of 5 steps, a gradation that goes from dark to light in 5 steps. To put something like this together, you'll probably want something a little bit thicker than paper because we'll be running a pencil around the inside, and it's really nice to just be able to let the pencil register right around the inside. You'll need your X-Acto knife, and you'll need some kind of cardstock or cardboard. Since we're all stuck at home, maybe the best place to find some cardboard is the recycling bin. Look at that, brand new cardboard straight out of the trash. What I'm going to do is use the spine of a box of cereal. That'll give me a template that I can use over and over and over again. Probably not a bad idea to pull out your cutting mat for this project, and nice sturdy straight edge. Your straight edges are a little bit bigger than the one that I grabbed, so I may pull out a ruler or something like that that I have here at the house. If you're going to cut through cardboard, always a good idea to have a nice sharp blade in your X-Acto. And I'll start just by cutting right along the spines, right along the folds of the corner of the cereal box. Remember, anytime you're cutting through something kind of thick, like cardboard or cardstock, make a couple of passes. That way it's easier on the blade, and you're less likely to skip and stick the blade into your leg or something. So I would like to take my piece of cardboard and basically reproduce this evenly spaced, basically a 1 by 1 inch square all the way down. It just so happens that even if you don't have a ruler handy, you have your cutting mats, which are perfectly divided out into 1/2 inch and 1 inch grid lines. So I'm going to line up my piece of cardboard with my grid, and either using a straight edge that you have at home, or using the clear straight edge from your art kit, mark off a 1/2 inch on the top, and then line up your cardboard and mark off a 1/2 inch all the way down. Now, you may have a long enough right angle square. I don't, so I've got to use this big guy, and this will help me mark off 1/2 inch from top to bottom. And I'll do the same thing on the other side. Now, if I want more or less a 1 inch gap in between each one of these, as I go down the line here, I'll line up 2 grid tick marks for an open box, and then a 1/2 inch gap. 2 tick marks for 1 inch, and a 1/2 inch gap. So what I've got is now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 1 inch gaps. I goofed up down here at the bottom. Thankfully, I didn't cut it yet. So just as a little visual reminder to myself, I'll scribble out on the insides of the box that I need to cut, and then I'll come back in with my X-Acto blade and open up each one of those windows. Now I've got another template that I can work in my 3D design sketchbook. So I'm going to pause for a minute on my life drawing, flip to another page, and render in at least 4 rows of this new template that I've got. So for starters, let's start to refine some of those techniques that we've already used in class. Now we have just, I've demonstrated in class a couple of sort of shorthand versions of these things, but we're going to use those lines, what we'll call cross-hatching. And let's use our rollerball pen for that. And when you're working, maybe even stand up, work quickly. Don't just move your fingers and your wrist, but move your whole hand, maybe even move your whole elbow, so that the lines flow from the tip of your pen. And we'll start by making a whole series of lines that move in the same direction to fill the box. If you go outside of the edges of the box, don't worry too much, but what I want you to more or less be paying attention to is keep the lines fairly evenly spaced, and then when you come back the other direction, try to keep them more or less the same space. The tighter those lines are together, the darker that box will feel. So if you do feel like you didn't get it right the first time, go ahead and work it in again. The next one, we're going to increase the space between each one of your lines. Notice how when I rendered in my first set of lines, I didn't put my lines quite so close together. Fewer lines, essentially more space, and that box will feel lighter. Now, if you continue in that same technique of adding a little bit more space and making fewer and fewer and fewer lines, your gradation will gently become lighter and lighter and lighter. I want you to make a series of crosshatch boxes here that go from dark to light. Now the next one that I want you to try, we'll change pens. Now use your felt tip marker for this one, and we're going to use a careful series of dots to fill that box. Now you know why I made sort of a small template here, so that I'm not filling in forever and ever and ever, because each one of those boxes is going to have to be full of dots. Now fight the urge to sort of peck at this thing like a woodpecker, because you'll ruin that small little tip on the front of your pen. But as you're laying these dots in, just touch the felt tip to the page, and even though I'm only pausing for a fraction of a second, I'm letting that ink flow from the tip of the pen onto the page. Keep your patterns somewhat randomized so that you don't start to see kind of light areas and dark areas. Try to have a nice even gradation, or a nice even tone throughout your whole box. This technique will definitely be the one that takes you the most time. I won't sit here and demonstrate the whole thing to you in this tutorial. What I'll do is just show you what it might look like if you build up a fair amount of density, right? Darker, lighter, 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 lightest. Okay. Now the third one I want you to try, and this is where we'll stop for right now, would be with your 4B pencil. So your 4B pencil has a nice thick kind of dark graphite on the inside, and so what you should be able to do is, using just the tip, don't blend with your thumb or anything, just the tip of the pencil, try to fill that in with about a mid-tone gray, and keep your shading really, really close together. It's not like the cross-hatching, it's actually trying to make somewhat of a solid tone. If you didn't quite get a solid tone, slightly change the angle of your drawing and work that back in. And before you get too much darker with that box, work back down through to your next ones. Again, lay in that medium tone, and it almost looks like maybe I should stop there and come back down here to a lighter one. And as I'm moving lighter and lighter down the way, I'm not putting fewer lines on the page, I'm putting less pressure on that tip. So if I start to kind of lose track of the kind of gentle gradation, I can always come back up to my top box here and add a little bit of pressure to make that one just a bit darker. Maybe make this one just a bit darker. Maybe make this one just a bit darker. And in so doing, I'm building up layers of graphite on the page. These three basic techniques are the techniques that now we will start to work back into a few of our drawings. So to finish up this tutorial, I'll jump back to my life drawing. And sticking with my 4B pencil, I'm going to render in some values just to kind of get a little feel for what this might look like if I bring it to life. Now, a couple of specific places I'm going to focus on for my first round of shading. Anywhere these two objects come together and look like they're almost touching, like right in this area here, I'm going to start by laying in a shadow. My shadows are going to be a little blocky at first. And then on the inside of an object, so in these two objects, they have an inside-outside that's fairly obvious. I'm going to focus on rendering in a shadow on the inside of that object. Another really obvious place where objects tend to throw shadows is anywhere that they touch the ground. And so I will carefully render in a shadow right at the edge of these two cylinders. This is just the very beginning then of how we will start to work with value and build back into our drawings some tonality, some lighting. We'll pause this demonstration here and come back to this technique of rendering lighting in our next tutorial.